Welcome to Infidelity Diaries. Explore the secrets and stories of infidelity with us. I will never forget that evening. It all started with an ordinary walk with my friends, one of those events meant to distract me from my everyday worries. But as soon as I saw him, I knew something was about to change. David, my husband's best friend, had just returned to the city after many years abroad. I had heard a lot about him from Ethan, but I had never met him in person before. His return was a surprise to me, and perhaps, if I had known how things would turn out, I wouldn't have smiled at him that moment. That evening, I went for a walk with my friends to the local art center, a place I had always loved for its cozy atmosphere and the opportunity to immerse myself in the world of art. We were slowly strolling through the galleries, discussing the paintings, and enjoying the pleasant evening, when I noticed him. David, a tall, confident man, was standing by one of the paintings, studying it intently. I immediately knew it was him, the best friend of my husband, Ethan. Ethan often spoke about him, mentioned him in many conversations, and I knew that David had only recently returned to the city after a long absence. But to meet him like this, by chance, was unexpected. "David?" I asked, approaching him with a smile. He turned around, and his face instantly lit up with a smile. "Jessica," he exclaimed, "it's so nice to finally meet you in person. I've heard so much about you from Ethan." "And I about you," I replied, laughing slightly. I was looking forward to finally meeting the legendary David. "Legendary?" He smirked. "I don't think I deserve such a title, but it's nice to know Ethan speaks so well of me." We both laughed, and I felt the tension I had initially felt slowly dissipate. The conversation flowed easily, as if we had known each other for a long time. David was charming, his smile was sincere, and his eyes sparkled with curiosity and warmth. He began to tell me about his travels, the places he had visited during his years away, and I listened with interest, forgetting about the time. We quickly discovered that we had a lot in common, a shared interest in art, literature, even cooking. He shared his impressions of the exhibitions he had visited in various countries, and I told him about my favorite paintings in this center. It seemed we were both surprised at how easily we found common ground. "I always knew you had good taste, Jessica," he said with a slight smile. "Ethan often mentioned that you both enjoy discussing books and movies." "Yes, that's true," I nodded. "Although lately, we haven't had much time for such conversations." There was a flicker of understanding in his eyes, and I realized that he had noticed the slight sadness in my voice. I quickly changed the subject, not wanting to delve into my marital troubles with my husband. We continued walking through the galleries, and I could feel some inexplicable tension growing between us. But I tried to suppress it, convincing myself that it was just an interesting conversation with my husband's friend. However, a small spark ignited within me, and I couldn't ignore that feeling. As my friends and I were about to leave, I turned to David. "It was nice meeting you in person," I said with a smile. "I hope we'll see each other again." "We will, Jessica," he replied, and I caught something in his eyes that made me hold his gaze for a moment. I left, but the sensation of his gaze lingering on me didn't fade, and at that moment, I was no longer sure that I wanted to suppress the feelings that had unexpectedly surged within me. A chance encounter with David at the art center was still spinning in my head. I couldn't shake thoughts of his smile, how his voice lowered slightly when he spoke to me, and how easy it was to talk with him. I knew it wasn't supposed to mean anything special, but something inside me resisted that thought. And when Ethan, coming home in the evening, announced that he had invited David to dinner, I felt something tighten inside me. Ethan was in a good mood when he told me about the upcoming dinner. "Jess," he said, walking into the kitchen where I was cooking dinner, "I invited David over for dinner tomorrow. He hasn't been in town for so long, and I thought it would be a great chance to catch up." "Oh, that's unexpected," I replied, trying to hide my anxiety. "But of course, it's a great idea. I'm sure he'll appreciate it." Ethan smiled and came over, putting his arms around my shoulders. Thank you, darling. I knew you'd be supportive. David is my best friend, and I want you two to get along. I nodded, smiling back. But inside, everything was boiling. The next morning, I decided to prepare for dinner, to make everything perfect. I spent the day cooking, trying to focus on the dishes and not think about yesterday's meeting. But memories of the conversation with David kept surfacing in my mind. When evening came, Ethan and I were in the kitchen when the doorbell rang. Ethan immediately went to answer it, and I, holding my breath, wiped my hands on a towel and followed him. David stood on the threshold, smiling, with a bottle of wine in hand. "Hey, David!" Ethan exclaimed, patting him on the shoulder. "Come on in. Jessica, you met him just the other day, right?" "Yes, we met," I replied, trying to sound calm, though I felt a slight excitement inside. As we sat down at the table, the atmosphere was tense. Ethan told stories about their adventures together with David, and I listened, trying to appear relaxed. But every time our eyes met, there was a spark between us. That silence between words, that quiet understanding that something was happening, something more than just friendly curiosity. "Jessica, you're an amazing cook," David said, looking up from his plate and directly at me. "Thank you," I smiled, feeling warmth spread through my chest from his compliment. "I'm glad you liked it." Ethan, noticing nothing strange, continued telling stories, while I, feeling the growing tension, barely listened. My attention was focused only on David. Every smile, every gesture seemed to be directed only at me. At some point, I realized that Ethan had gotten up from the table. "I have to make a couple of work calls," he said, standing up. "I'll be quick." When he left for the office, leaving us alone, the tension in the room became almost tangible. I felt my heart start to beat faster. David was silent, but his gaze was too eloquent. "Maybe you could help me in the kitchen," I suggested, trying to distract myself from thoughts and slightly ease the situation. "Of course I'd be happy to," he smiled. We went to the kitchen, and I began clearing the plates, trying to look as busy as possible, but I could feel his gaze on me. David came closer to take the plates, and our hands accidentally touched. The touch was like an electric shock, so unexpected and strong that I almost dropped the plate. "Sorry," he said quietly, but didn't step back. His hand remained near mine, and I felt goosebumps running down my skin. "It's okay," I replied, feeling my voice betray a slight tremor. "It's all right." We were standing too close to each other, and this tension between us, barely noticeable but incredibly palpable, grew with each passing second. I felt my cheeks begin to burn. We started talking about trivial things, about how I enjoyed cooking, how he missed home-cooked meals during his travels, but every phrase, every exchange of glances, was like a step towards something more. "You know, Jessica," he suddenly said, "I think I understand why Ethan spoke about you so often. You're really very special." I laughed, trying to hide my embarrassment. "Thank you, David," I said, still smiling. "But honestly, Ethan exaggerates." "I don't think he exaggerates," he replied quietly, his voice becoming more serious. I looked at him, our eyes met, and at that moment, I felt something change between us. It was more than just a friendly conversation. It was something we both couldn't resist. But suddenly, Ethan returned to the room, and that magical moment dissolved into the air, leaving behind only a trace of unfulfilled desire. David and I quickly moved to opposite ends of the kitchen as if nothing had happened, but inside, everything was boiling. That dinner left too many questions and completely unexpected answers. Ethan suggested going to a pool party that our friends Sarah and Michael were hosting. He said it would be a great way to relax and spend time with friends. The idea didn't particularly excite me. I felt like we already had plenty to do at home. But I knew Ethan loved such events. He always thought we needed to spend more time with friends. "Jess, you remember Sarah and Michael's party this Saturday, right?" he asked me over dinner. "You're going, aren't you?" I nodded. a bit absent-mindedly stirring the salad on my plate. Yes, of course, I'll go, I replied. I hope it'll be fun. Ethan smiled. It will be, I promise. Besides, David will be there too. He said he enjoys reconnecting with old friends and making new ones. At the mention of David's name, something inside me stirred. Memories of our last dinner were still fresh in my mind, and I couldn't stop thinking about the way he looked at me, the tension that had arisen between us. I quickly reminded myself, he's just my husband's friend. We must keep it strictly friendly. Oh, that's great, I said, trying to sound as casual as possible. It'll be nice to see him again. Saturday arrived, and we headed to the party. As soon as we arrived, I felt a slight nervousness that I couldn't quite explain. I put on my favorite dress, hoping it would help me feel more confident, but the feeling lingered. The party was in full swing. By the pool, a crowd of people were laughing, chatting, and some had already taken a dip in the water. I stood next to Ethan, who was engrossed in a discussion with Michael about their latest work projects. I was half listening when I noticed David. He was wearing a white shirt, casually unbuttoned at the top, highlighting his athletic build. I saw his gaze find me in the crowd, and to my surprise, I felt a spark ignite inside me. Jess, I'm going to grab some drinks, Ethan said, interrupting my thoughts. I nodded, and he walked toward the bar. At that moment, David started making his way over to me, and I felt my heart beat faster. Hi, Jessica, he said, smiling as he approached. Good to see you again. Hi, David, I replied, trying to stay composed. How are you enjoying the party? It's great, but now it's even better, he said with a slight smile. My cheeks flushed, and I realized we needed to find a quieter spot. Maybe we should go to the garden, I suggested, nodding toward a quiet corner behind the house. It's too noisy here. Sure, he replied, and we slowly made our way to the garden. When we reached the shade of the trees, the noise of the party faded, and we were surrounded by the garden's quiet atmosphere. We started talking about trivial things, about how time had passed since our last meeting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing. You really are wonderful, Jessica, he suddenly said. I think Ethan is very lucky to have a wife like you. Thank you, I replied, feeling the tension grow. You're a very interesting person, too. He stepped closer, and I realized that I was standing too close to him. Our eyes met, and at that moment, I could no longer resist. Our lips met in a quiet but deep kiss. Inside, everything spun, a mix of guilt, fear, and excitement that I couldn't control. We both knew we should stop, but something inside told me this was just the beginning of something bigger. We shouldn't, I whispered, pulling away, though everything inside screamed otherwise. I know, David whispered back, his voice quiet but firm. But I don't think we'll be able to forget this. We promised each other not to let it happen again, but we both understood. This moment marked the beginning of something we would have to face, no matter what. After the kiss in the garden by the pool, everything became even more complicated. David and I tried to avoid each other, pretending that everything was in the past, but our glances told a different story. Soon, we realized that fighting this was impossible. And so, our secret meetings began. We agreed to meet at a small motel on the outskirts of town. It was an unremarkable place that none of our acquaintances would ever think to visit. I parked in front of the shabby facade, my heart pounding wildly. My hands trembled as I pulled the keys from the ignition. Thousands of thoughts raced through my mind. Am I doing the right thing? Is this worth the risk? I stepped out of the car and headed to the room that David had booked for us in advance. The door opened slightly, and I saw him standing in the dimly lit room, with only the soft glow from a bedside lamp illuminating his face. I thought you might change your mind, he whispered, closing the door behind me. So did I replied, feeling my knees weaken from the excitement. We stood facing each other, unsure of how to begin, but that awkwardness lasted only a moment. David stepped forward, his hands gently grasping my shoulders, and I felt warmth fill me inside. I can't stop thinking about you, Jessica, he said quietly, his breath brushing against my ear. Our lips met again, this time in a bolder, more passionate kiss, as if all the repressed feelings suddenly burst forth. I felt his hands glide down my back, and I could no longer think about what would happen next. We didn't say a word. Everything was conveyed in that kiss, in every touch. The following week, we decided to meet again. David suggested a place that none of our acquaintances would ever choose, a rooftop of an old building in the city center. He knew one of the security guards and got permission to go up. When I climbed the stairs and stepped onto the roof, David was already waiting. The wind ruffled his hair, and he stood at the very edge, looking out at the city lights. "I've always loved this place," he said, turning to me with a smile. "You feel free here, like the whole world is at your feet." I moved closer and looked down. The view was mesmerizing, the lights, the sounds of the city, the night sky. But all I could think about was David, about his presence next to me. "It's beautiful," I whispered, looking at him. "Yes, but not as beautiful as you," he replied, reaching out to pull me closer. I allowed him to draw me near, and our bodies pressed together. We stood there, embracing, enjoying a moment of silence and peace amidst the hustle of the city. His fingers gently ran through my hair, and his breath brushed against my neck. "No one will find us here," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "We can just be ourselves." The moment was both exhilarating and frightening. We sat on the rooftop, hidden from prying eyes, sharing our dreams and fears. Our conversations were filled not just with words, but with emotions we tried to hide from the rest of the world. With each meeting, our attraction grew stronger. Eventually, David suggested meeting at his place. I knew it could be risky, but I was burning with the desire to see him in a more familiar setting, to know how he lived, what surrounded him. His house was in a quiet neighborhood, away from the city center. When I arrived, David opened the door and invited me in. The interior was stylish, understated, yet cozy. I noticed books scattered across the table and a guitar leaning against the wall. "Welcome," he said, smiling. We sat on the couch, and he poured me a glass of wine. The conversation was initially a bit tense, as if we both were aware of the seriousness of the moment. But gradually, the tension began to ease. We talked about trivial things, about life, laughed at old stories. At some point, he stood up and turned on some music. Soft jazz filled the room. He extended his hand to me. "Shall we dance?" he offered. I nodded, and we began to slowly sway to the music. I felt his hands wrap around my waist, and once again, I felt that familiar wave of warmth and desire. At that moment, I realized that no promises could keep us from being together anymore. We stopped pretending. The kisses became more passionate, the embraces tighter. Everything around us disappeared, leaving only the two of us in this small, cozy world where there was no room for anyone else. The past few weeks, I felt everything was spiraling out of control. I began to notice it was becoming increasingly difficult to hide my feelings. David and I had agreed not to see each other too often, but the attraction between us grew stronger by the day, and I started to realize that my behavior was changing. Ethan noticed almost immediately. I became less attentive to his words, often distracted, and sometimes I simply couldn't recall what he had just said. My thoughts kept drifting back to David, to our secret meetings, and his touch. One evening, when Ethan came home earlier than usual, I heard his footsteps in the hallway and quickly slipped my phone into my pocket. My heart was racing. I had just received a message from David. "I can't stop thinking about you." But Ethan mustn't see that. "Jess, are you hiding something?" he asked, looking at me intently. "No, of course not," I replied too hastily, feeling my cheeks flush. "Why do you ask?" "You've been kind of distant lately," he said, his eyes full of doubt. "I'm just worried. Are you okay?" Yeah, everything's fine. I tried to smile, but it came out strained. Ethan nodded, but I felt his suspicions only growing. Over the next few days, he started paying closer attention to my actions. I began to feel his watchful eyes, as if he were trying to read my thoughts. One evening, when I came out of the shower, I noticed him standing by the window, staring off into the distance with a pensive look on his face. "What are you thinking about?" I asked, moving closer. He turned to me and shrugged slightly. "I think something's changed, Jessica," he finally said. "You're not the same as before. And I don't know why." My heart skipped a beat. I didn't know what to say. Instead, I just placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're worrying for nothing, Ethan. Everything's fine," I whispered. But he didn't seem convinced. A few days later, he decided to seek help from the one person he trusted the most: David. When David received Ethan's call, he felt a tight knot form inside him. Ethan was concerned and asked to meet. "David, I need to talk," Ethan began when they sat down at a cafe. "I don't know what's going on with Jessica. She's different. I thought maybe you noticed something. You were with us at Sarah and Michael's party." David tried to stay calm, though inside, he felt torn apart. How could he help his best friend find answers to something for which he himself was to blame? "Yes, I noticed she seemed a bit tense," David replied cautiously. "But maybe it's just stress. You know how it can be." Ethan looked at him, his gaze filled with doubt. "I'm not sure. It's something more, like she's hiding something." David nodded, trying to conceal the inner turmoil gnawing at him. He knew that every step he took could reveal their secret, but he couldn't turn his back on Ethan. He tried to support him while knowing he was teetering on the edge. "Listen," David suggested, trying to sound calm. "Maybe you should just talk to her openly? Sometimes we imagine things that aren't really there." "Maybe," Ethan sighed. "I just don't want to be wrong. If I say something and it turns out I'm mistaken." David nodded, trying to hide his growing guilt. He knew that every meeting with Jessica only made things more complicated. He wanted to be honest with Ethan, but he knew that if the truth came out, everything would change. This conversation left him deep in thought. He knew their secret meetings with Jessica had to stop, but he also understood that his own heart was already too deeply involved in this forbidden affair. We decided to meet by the river, in a secluded spot where the trees intertwined to form a dense green curtain, shielding us from prying eyes. The water gently murmured, reflecting the last rays of the setting sun, and I gazed at its surface, trying to calm my thoughts. But the moment I saw David approaching, all my efforts were in vain. He looked slightly agitated, and it showed in his eyes. I felt my heart start to race, as if anticipating something important, inevitable. As he came closer, I felt his presence like a powerful surge of energy. We remained silent for a long time, listening to the sounds of nature, savoring the moment of quiet that seemed to separate us from the rest of the world. But inside, I was in turmoil. I knew I couldn't keep this inside any longer. "David," I began, my voice trembling slightly. "I don't know how to say this, but I think I'm starting to fall in love with you." He turned to me, and in his eyes, I saw a mix of surprise and understanding. I didn't know what to expect, and every moment felt like an eternity. "Jessica," he said softly, stepping closer to me. "I feel it too, but I don't know what to do." His words were gentle, but I heard so much pain and doubt in them. He took my hand, and I felt his warmth, his hesitation. "You know what this means?" he continued. "If we continue this, we'll destroy everything. My friendship with Ethan, everything we both know." I nodded, feeling tears well up in my eyes. He was right. We were on the brink of something destructive, but I could no longer control my feelings. "I know, but I can't stop. I can't just pretend that nothing's happening," I whispered. "I don't want to lose you, David." He sighed and pulled me close, hugging me so tightly that I could feel his heart beating in sync with mine. I felt his lips touch my hair, and that moment became the warmest and most real of all our encounters. "I don't want to lose you either, Jessica," he finally said, "but we have to be careful. This is too dangerous." I clung to him even tighter, as if trying to forget all the fears and doubts. In that moment, I realized that we were both too deeply involved in this whirlwind of emotions and passion. "Then let's keep meeting, but carefully," I suggested, trying to find a compromise between my feelings and reality. David nodded, his eyes glistening with emotion. "Okay," he replied, "but promise me that if it gets too difficult, we'll stop. Promise you'll tell me if you feel like everything is spiraling out of control." I nodded, though deep down, I knew I had already lost control long ago. We stood by the river, and the night slowly wrapped us in its embrace. I knew our meetings were becoming increasingly dangerous, but I couldn't stop. We both understood that we were treading on thin ice, yet we could no longer turn back. It all began when Ethan accidentally saw my message on my phone. I hadn't realized I left the phone on the kitchen table when I stepped into the bedroom for a minute. Ethan was making breakfast, and when the phone screen lit up, he glanced at it. I returned to the kitchen as he was already looking at the screen. I didn't know exactly what he saw, but I sensed that something had changed in his gaze. "Is everything okay?" I asked, trying to sound as calm as possible, but my heart was pounding so hard that it seemed to be audible even in the next room. "Yes, everything's fine," he replied, turning away from me and going back to the pan. But I noticed that his voice trembled slightly. I needed to leave, and I tried to act normally. But when I got home later, I noticed that my phone was not where I had left it. Panic gripped me. Had I left messages with David in plain sight? Ethan seemed tense when he saw me, but he gave no indication that something was wrong. In the following days, he began to behave differently. He became more attentive and observant. He asked more questions about my plans, where I was going, and when I would be back. One evening, when I picked up my phone, I noticed that several messages from David were marked as "read." My heart sank. This could only mean one thing. Ethan had seen them. That particular message, "Jessica, I can't stop thinking about you," which I had forgotten to delete, and perhaps a few others. I felt a cold fear spreading inside me. But Ethan said nothing. He played the role of the unsuspecting husband, while I tried to hide my feelings, not knowing that he had already started to keep tabs on me. He became more vigilant about my habits, noticing when I left the house, how long I was out, and who I was talking to. I started noticing his presence where it hadn't been before. Chance encounters on the street, his car parked around the corner when I left a cafe. I realized he was trying to find something out. Ethan started to notice when I left the house at odd times, saying I was going to meet friends or to the store. He saw how I looked at my phone more often than usual, how my eyes would light up when I received a new message. One day, when I said I was going to yoga, Ethan decided to follow me. I was unaware of this, not suspecting that his car was quietly trailing behind mine. I arrived at the designated spot, the same motel where David and I had met for the first time. Ethan stopped at a safe distance, his heart pounding in sync with mine. He saw me enter, and a few minutes later, a man approached the door. Even in the dim light of the headlights, he recognized him immediately. David, his best friend, the one he trusted. David and I were sitting on the edge of the bed, in our little sanctuary from the world. We spoke in hushed tones, embracing each other, savoring every moment together. At that moment, I felt safe, as if here, in this motel room, we could leave reality behind. But that illusion didn't last long. Suddenly, the door to the room flew open. I gasped in surprise, and David sprang to his feet, as if ready to defend himself. Ethan stood in the doorway, his face twisted with rage and pain. His eyes darted between us, as if trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Panic gripped me. My whole body froze, and I could only watch Ethan, who seemed to be struggling to keep from shouting. What? What is going on here? Ethan's voice trembled with anger. I can't believe this. My wife, and my best friend. I tried to say something, but the words stuck in my throat. David raised his hands, as if to explain, but Ethan wouldn't give him a chance. Don't you dare say a word, he shouted. You both betrayed me. You, the two people I trusted more than anyone in the world. Tears began to roll down my cheeks. This was the moment I had feared the most. Everything we tried to hide, everything we thought would remain a secret, had suddenly surfaced. Ethan, I began, but he cut me off. I don't want to hear a word, he growled. Do you think I didn't notice? That I didn't see how you disappeared, how you became cold and distant? And you, he turned to David. You, I trusted you like a brother. David stood silently, knowing that any words would only make things worse. Ethan looked as if his world had collapsed before his eyes. His hands were trembling, and he barely contained his tears. You both! His voice grew quieter, but still held a note of fury. You both betrayed me. You, who were closest to me. And now I don't want to see either of you. Ever. Ethan took a step back, as if unable to remain in the same room with us. His face was pale, his lips pressed into a thin line, and his eyes filled with so much pain that I couldn't look at him. This was the man I once loved, and now I saw him in the worst state imaginable. I'm leaving, he finally said, his voice sharp as a blow, and don't try to stop me. He turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. I sat on the edge of the bed, unable to hold back the tears. David moved closer and tried to embrace me, but I pushed him away. All I felt at that moment was emptiness and shame. We both remained silent, listening to Ethan's footsteps fading down the hallway. The world we had tried to build for ourselves crumbled in an instant, leaving us facing reality and the consequences of our decisions. The next morning, I barely slept. Every minute stretched endlessly, and thoughts tormented me. I kept remembering Ethan's expression when he caught David and me. His eyes, full of pain and disappointment, haunted me. I knew I had to go home and try to explain everything, apologize, and somehow fix the situation. I stood in front of the mirror for a long time, trying to compose myself, but my eyes were red from crying, and my hands trembled. In the end, I decided that it didn't matter how I looked. Ethan deserved to hear my apology, and I was ready to do whatever it took to at least try to make amends. I reached our house, not knowing what to expect. My key still fit the lock, which gave me a faint hope. Maybe he hadn't completely made up his mind. Maybe we still had a chance. I entered the house, feeling the silence hanging over every corner. The hallway was unchanged, but the air was tense, like before a storm. I cautiously closed the door behind me and took a step forward, listening to every sound. Ethan! I called, my own voice trembling with anxiety. Are you home? Seconds seemed like an eternity. Finally, I heard his footsteps. He came out of the bedroom, stopping in the doorway, and looked at me. There was no anger or pain in his eyes, only cold, impenetrable detachment. Do you have something to say, Jessica? His voice was even, with no hint of emotion. I moved closer, feeling my heart contract. He was so close, and yet so far away. Ethan, please listen to me, I began, my voice shaking, struggling to hold back tears. I know I made a terrible mistake. I know I betrayed your trust, and I'm so sorry. I never wanted things to end like this. He looked at me, his face remaining stone-like. I continued, trying to find any words that might make things right. I love you, Ethan. I understand what I did, and I'm willing to do anything to win you back. Please, give me a chance to explain. He stood silently for a few more moments, then his lips tightened into a thin line. You think you can just come here and apologize, and everything will go back to the way it was? His voice was cold and distant. Do you really believe that? I nodded, tears streaming down my cheeks. Yes, I hoped. I hoped we could find a way through this together. I'm ready to fight for us. He smirked, and that smirk was full of bitterness. Fight? He repeated. You want to fight for something that's already destroyed? You want me to forgive you for what you did, knowing that you lied to my face and hid your meetings? You want me to pretend nothing happened? I tried to argue, but he raised his hand, silencing me. No, Jessica, he said, his voice growing harsher. I can't do that. You've crossed the line where there's no turning back. You betrayed me, and I can't live with you anymore. I felt the world around me crumbling. It was the end. The end of everything I knew, everything we had built together. But, Ethan, please, I tried again. No. His voice was firm and resolute. I want you to pack your things and leave, and I'm filing for divorce. These words hit me like lightning. I stood there, paralyzed, unable to believe he had actually said that. Divorce? I whispered, not believing my ears. Yes, he said decisively. Divorce. I don't want to see you anymore, Jessica. You made your choice, and now we both will live with its consequences. I looked at him, and there was not a trace of pity or regret in his eyes. He was determined, unyielding, and I realized that it was truly over. Okay, I finally managed to say, feeling my heart breaking into pieces. I'll leave. I slowly made my way to the bedroom to pack my things, feeling my legs weaken from exhaustion. It was the end. The end of everything I knew. When the door slammed behind me, I felt something snap inside. The world I knew had crumbled in just a few minutes. I stood on the doorstep of our house, holding a bag with my belongings, not knowing where to go or what to do next. All my thoughts boiled down to one thing. I needed to find David. He was the only one who would understand and support me. I couldn't go back to my parents or reach out to friends because I felt that no one could understand or accept my actions. David was the one with whom I shared this crazy passion, this mistake that had become an unbearable reality. I dialed his number and waited, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. Hello! His voice was steady, but I immediately sensed something different, something unfamiliar. David, it's me, I whispered, feeling tears well up in my eyes. Ethan! Ethan kicked me out. He filed for divorce. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear his breathing, but I couldn't tell what he was thinking. I'm so sorry, Jessica, he finally said. I truly didn't know it would go this far. Sorry, I repeated, blinking in surprise. You say sorry, as if it doesn't concern you. David, I've lost everything. Everything that was important to me. You're the only one left. I know, he replied softly, but I sensed a strange tension in his voice. But we need to meet and talk. We agreed to meet at the park, at our usual spot by the old bench, under the sprawling oak tree. I arrived early, feeling a rising anxiety inside me. I hoped he would support me, that together we would find a way to get through this. But when I saw him approaching, I immediately felt that something was wrong. David, please tell me we can get through this, I started, trying to keep my voice steady. Tell me we have a future. He sat down beside me, but his gaze was fixed on the ground. Jessica, I'm not sure we can be together, he finally said, without looking me in the eye. These words struck me like a blow to the chest. What? What do you mean? I whispered, unable to believe my ears. I've thought about it. I can't be with you, Jessica. I realize I made a huge mistake. I've ruined everything, your life, my life, the friendship with Ethan. I just can't. I looked at him, feeling my eyes fill with tears. But you wanted this, David, I protested. You knew what we were getting into. You promised we would be together, no matter what. He shook his head, still not lifting his gaze. I thought I could handle it. Thought it was what I wanted. But when Ethan saw us together, when I saw him suffering, I realized I couldn't do it. I can't be the cause of destroying his life. So you're just going to walk away? I couldn't hold back the tears anymore. You're going to leave me alone after all this? He finally looked at me, and I saw the pain in his eyes. I don't know what else to do, Jessica, he whispered. Maybe I'm afraid of the responsibility. Maybe I'm just not ready for this kind of life. I hoped that you. I started, but my voice trembled and I couldn't continue. I know you hoped, he interrupted, but I can't do this anymore. I can't carry this burden. Forgive me. He stood up and I felt the cold envelop me completely. I wanted to hold him, to stop him, but the words stuck in my throat. Is this it? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Yes, he said quietly. I'm sorry. I watched him walk away, feeling my life collapse again, now for good. He left me alone at the moment I needed support the most. I realized that I was completely alone. Days passed, each one stretching endlessly. I felt trapped in a time warp where everything had stopped. The home I once shared with Ethan now felt foreign, and I couldn't even think about returning there. Instead, I had rented a small room in an old hotel, where even the walls seemed saturated with melancholy. I sat in that room for hours, unable to find the strength to get out of bed or open the curtains to let in daylight. My mind was consumed by the same thoughts, the same mistake. How could I have done this? How could I have destroyed everything? Every night, I woke up from nightmares. The dreams took me back to the moment when Ethan opened the motel door and saw us with David. I saw his eyes, filled with pain, and every time it felt like he was standing in front of me, asking how I could have done this to him. I woke up in tears, my heart aching as though it was being torn apart. Days were no easier. I recalled every moment with Ethan, how we laughed, how we spent evenings in the kitchen, how he held me before bed. All those moments now seemed precious but irretrievably lost. I felt like a traitor, as if my heart no longer belonged to me. One morning, I finally mustered the courage to leave the room. I dressed and went to the park, hoping that the fresh air might help me distract myself, even just a little. But even there, among the green trees and the birds' songs, I couldn't escape the thought that I had made a terrible mistake. I sat on a bench and rested my head on my hands. Passers-by walked by, oblivious to my presence, and I felt my shoulders shaking with sobs. How could I? I whispered, not expecting an answer. Memories of David surfaced in my mind. I tried to recall the moment when everything began to unravel, when he first spoke to me in a way that made me feel special. I thought it was love, that this passion could justify everything, but now it all seemed empty and meaningless. Days passed, and I still tried to understand why things went so far. Why couldn't I stop? Why did I allow myself to get caught up in something doomed from the start? Every morning, I woke up with this thought, and every night, I fell asleep with the same question. I began to fear meeting acquaintances. I was afraid they would look at me with judgment, whisper behind my back. I isolated myself more and more, locking myself in my small room, talking to myself, trying to find some justification for my actions. Sometimes I sat by the phone, trying to dial Ethan's number. I thought that if I could hear his voice, I might be able to explain, to tell him how deeply I regretted it. But each time I stopped, realizing it was too late. He didn't want to hear from me anymore. He had made that clear. I was losing hope. The only thought left was, what have I done? Every fiber of my being screamed with pain and regret. I had destroyed everything, my marriage, my relationship with Ethan, my life. It was all my fault. Sitting in the empty room, surrounded only by silence, I finally understood that I would have to live with this regret for the rest of my life. My betrayal had become part of me, and I could no longer escape this truth. If I could turn back time, I would do everything differently. I would have stopped at the point when it was still possible to save what was important. But unfortunately, the past cannot be changed. My heart is broken, my life is shattered, and every day I feel the bitterness of my mistakes. If you ever find yourself facing a choice that could harm those you love, Stop and think. Sometimes a moment of passion or a fleeting infatuation can destroy everything you have built over the years. Don't follow in my footsteps. Don't give in to temptation. Don't let yourself make the same mistakes I did. Cherish those who love you and don't destroy your life for illusions.